There's something that I wanted to mention in connection to what we were talking about last time. Last thing we talked about are the cnidarians. Well, it's kind of a segue from the cnidarians to what we're doing today. Today we're going to talk about phytoplankton. And it turns out that some phytoplankton live within the flesh of cnidarians, and in fact other organisms as well. Phytoplankton that live within the flesh of other organisms are called zooxanthellae. And I may have mentioned this in a previous lecture in connection with another matter. Zooxanthellae, the word literally means stranger to animals. Xanthos is a stranger, or xantho is a stranger in Greek. Zo is animal, so stranger to the animals. These are phytoplankton that live within the flesh of other animals. And it includes things like salamander eggs and the eggs of certain fish, all of which don't have any immediate bearing on the discussion which we're going to have now. What has bearing on what we're going to talk about now is the fact that zooxanthellae are very important in the flesh of coral animals. They live in the flesh of coral animals. And as I described in class, or in previous lecture, they are responsible for the color of a coral reef. Coral reef is kind of like a beige, yeah, pretty much a beige color. Except if you kill all the coral animals, it's perfectly white, calcium carbonate. Well, the beige color is due to the phytoplankton that live in the flesh of the coral animals. These zooxanthellae that live in the flesh of the coral animals. Now, there was a controversy about the impact of these organisms, which we could call appropriately commensals. A commensal organism, or commensals are organisms that live in intimate contact with other organisms. Commensals are organisms that live in intimate contact with other organisms. Commensal kind of means living together. And there was a question as to the importance of these phytoplankton that live in the flesh of cnidarians, such as coral polyps. And there was controversy over that. Originally, a scientist named Young created an experiment in which he destroyed all of these zooxanthellae in a batch of coral. So what he did basically was set up a tank in which he had coral animals, and he first destroyed the zooxanthellae in these animals. And then he fed these coral animals loads of shrimp. And what he found out was that coral animals survive perfectly well in the absence of the zooxanthellae. As long as you give them enough food, they're happy. So that was Young's position. Young's position was that these zooxanthellae were not essential to the survival of coral animals. And then Odum came along. Odum, a famous ecologist, and he said, well, your experiment is not realistic. It doesn't reflect what happens in the environment. And what Odum did was calculate the real number of shrimp and other organisms available as food for these coral animals. In a natural ecosystem, he determined how much food was really available to these organisms. Have a seat right here. Pull up a chair. And what he determined is, in a natural environment, there is not enough food for the coral animals. And it is all the nutrients produced by these photosynthetic zooxanthellae that allow the coral animals to survive. So, knowing this is very important, not only for its intrinsic value, but so that you can understand when you create an experiment that's supposed to replicate, that's supposed to teach you something about what's going on in a natural environment, sometimes it doesn't replicate what's going on in the natural environment. You create artificial circumstances, as did Young. Young created a situation where there was no zooxanthellae, and he provided it with plenty of food. Well, in an environment where there's ample food, it's not a problem. But in an environment where there's too little food, it's a major problem. And in fact, we see this today. One of the big problems with coral reefs around the world is so-called coral bleaching. And coral bleaching is when the zooxanthellae, which give the coral animals color, die. And so now they are colorless, hence bleached. And when coral bleaching occurs, the living animals of the coral reef, the living coral reef polyps, die. A real demonstration of how essential the zooxanthellae are to the coral animals. You had a question?
So are zooxanthellae essential to the existence of coral animals? Or
say it again, please.
Are zooxanthellae essential to the existence of
They
coral
are essential in a natural environment to the existence of coral.
Okay.
Right. All right, so what we have here is kind of a segue into what we're about to talk about today, and that is phytoplankton. I say it's a segue because these zooxanthellae are indeed phytoplankton. They can grow freely, and they can be also embedded within the flesh of organisms such as Cnidaria. All right, let's talk about phytoplankton now. As you know, phytoplankton are the grasses of the sea. Phytoplankton are the grasses of the sea. What does that mean? Well, of course, since humans are terrestrial animals, we tend to relate what we learn about foreign environments, anything that's not on land, to land. So, on land, if you take a look at a buffalo herd or a herd of cattle or a herd of sheep, just about any organisms that survives eating vegetation, you find out that they survive on the grasses. Think of the Great Plains of the western United States. Buffalo, innumerable buffalo out there, innumerable cattle out there, all feeding on the grasses. The grasses are what supplies their sustenance. Now, imagine that you destroyed all the grasses. And you went back a year later, or 2 years later, or 3 years later, and there's no grass there, and yet you still have an equal number of buffalo and cattle and you name it. That would be kind of peculiar. They have nothing to eat, but they're still surviving. Well, that doesn't happen. If you take away all the grasses, they all die. Let's go to the 1930s. 1930s in Europe. In the 1930s in Europe, there was a disease that destroyed most of the rooted vegetation, things like eelgrass, along the European coast. So 1930s, most of the eelgrass and other vegetation along the European coast was destroyed. And everyone assumed that the fish population would decline, because everyone thought it was those grasses that fed the fish, that supported the entire food chain. Well, it turned out that once these seagrasses were destroyed, there was no problem. The fish were just as abundant as they were before. And marine biologists began to think, well, what is in fact supporting the marine food chain? And they began to look at a microscopic level at seawater and find out that these microscopic organisms, these phytoplankton, were really the grasses of the sea, meaning they were at the base of the food chain that supports everything else. And naturally, one would ask, how come if these organisms support the entire food chain in the ocean, how come you can't see them without a microscope? And we discussed this in class and said that these things are super abundant in terms of how much production of these organisms there is, how many are produced, but they're not seen because they're consumed as quickly as they're produced. You know, if I had 100 pennies in my hand, you would see 100 pennies and say, that's a lot of pennies. If I put one at a time on the table and one of you would have picked them up, then after I threw out 100 pennies, you wouldn't see anything on the table. And yet, you know, I put out 100 pennies. The same thing with the phytoplankton. Phytoplankton reproduce rapidly. They support the entire food chain, but at any one time, you don't see them. You don't see at any one time their biomass. And biomass is simply a term that indicates the mass of living material. So the biomass of phytoplankton is not apparent at any instant because they're gobbled up as quickly as they're produced. Now, next question we have to answer is, where are these phytoplankton? Well, you would expect that they would be at upper levels in the ocean. Why at upper levels in the ocean? Because they're plants and they need light. They need sunlight. And in fact, that's the case. So let's see precisely at what level they exist in the ocean. Let us consider the amount of sunlight that reaches the surface of the ocean to be 100%. Now, we're talking hitting the surface of the ocean, you have 100% light. If you go down just 15 meters, what's 15 meters? What's a meter approximately in terms of feet? About 3 feet, 3+ feet, yeah, 39 point something inches. All right, so figure about 3 feet. Go down 15 meters, we're talking about 45 feet, right? You go down just 45 feet in the ocean, and the amount of light that gets there is 50% of what you had at the surface. Half the light gets absorbed by water. And then if you go down to 25 meters, yeah, from the surface all the way down to 25 meters, so we're talking about 75 feet. There's only about 1 to 3% of the amount of light that hit the surface. 75 feet down, 25 meters, just about 1 to 3%, a minor fraction of the amount of light that you get at the surface. And so, what you find out is that the phytoplankton, for the most part, are located within this first 15 meters of ocean water. Why? Because that's where they get enough light to survive. And by the way, different phytoplankton prefer different levels of light. Some prefer to be higher, some prefer to be lower, some prefer to be in the middle. You may have, how many people have plants at home? Plants growing? Do you have any plants that like full sunlight? And do you have any plants that like moderate sunlight or low sunlight? Well, there's some plants that don't do well under high sunlight. If you ever gone to buy grass in a Lowe's or Home Depot or something like that, they have full sun grass seeds and shaded grass seeds. You know, different types of grasses like different amounts of light. Well, the same thing occurs in the ocean. The different phytoplankton like different amounts of light. And so they can be distributed within this 15-meter depth from the surface. All right, so that's the general picture for phytoplankton. That's the overview. Now what we want to do is take a look at several major groups of phytoplankton and see a couple of things. We want to see what role they play in feeding the ocean, or what role they may play in other aspects of marine ecosystems. For example, how many people have ever heard of red tide? Raise your hand. All right, most people have heard of red tide. You know that red tide is a toxic phytoplankton. It can be, in the right circumstance, deadly to humans. It can be quite deadly to fish. A major problem in the ocean. We talked about brown tide last time, right? Brown tide can devastate the scallop population. Why? Because it's not palatable to the scallops in the context of what we spoke about last time. How many people have ever heard of Pfiesteria? No reason you should have, but anybody ever hear of Pfiesteria? Imagine if you went fishing and you caught a bunch of fish and you went back home, only you knocked on the door and it was the wrong house. And when the person opened the door, you didn't recognize anybody inside and you were very confused. And in fact, you couldn't see them very well either. Pfiesteria is a phytoplankton which people who do fishing and catch the fish and come in contact with the Pfiesteria that may be on the fish, they lose their memory. And they lose their ability to see distinctly. And they become very confused. So we're talking about an organism that's very toxic. It can screw up your brain. Red tide can kill you, Pfiesteria can confuse you and interfere with your vision and do other things. And there are some other phytoplankton that are even parasitic on fish. So we'll talk about the different roles that different phytoplankton play in the ocean. And the first group of phytoplankton that we want to mention are the Cyanophyta. Cyanophyta. Now take a look at the word. First of all, phyta means plant. Cyano refers to a blue-green color, a blue-green color. If somebody were to poison you with cyanide, your lips would turn bluish-green because they would be deprived of oxygen. They would be deprived of the red blood cells that supply you with oxygen. Well, one or the other. Let's put it this way. Let me not take it that far. When you're deprived of oxygen, you turn a little bluish. Hence the term cyano means blue. So we're talking about a blue-green phytoplankton. Well, this is kind of unusual, blue-green phytoplankton. This thing, Cyanophyta, is a whole group of organisms that you find mostly in fresh water. And they create a slime in the fresh water because they release a lot of mucus, and they have a mucus covering over their surface. And so when you see them in a pond or in a river, they create very unpleasant conditions for swimming. They also produce chemicals that smell lousy, and on top of that, some of them are very toxic. All right, so what do we have with Cyanophyta? Cyanophyta, mostly fresh water. Generally, they produce a slime. And so in a freshwater environment, it would be very unpleasant for swimming. They don't smell well. They don't smell good. And also, there are some that are very toxic. And they can be toxic to fish, and they can also be toxic to animals. How toxic to animals? Well, there was a lake in Idaho called Storm Lake. And one day they found 200,000 dead animals around the lake because there had been a bloom. When I say a bloom, it means an overgrowth. There had been a bloom of these blue-green algae, Cyanophyta. That's the other name for them, a common name, blue-green algae. There had been a bloom of these, And in that bloom were some very toxic ones. The animals came down to drink, 200,000 animals died. Yes,
This was, this was called Storm Lake, right?
Storm Lake, Idaho, right. So, some of them can be very toxic. Blue-green algae are a big problem for us. Why for us? Well, when you take a drink out of any of these water fountains over here, that water comes from the Hackensack Reservoir. The Hackensack Reservoir has blue-green algae in it, so many that they have to be combated by introducing into the water copper sulfate, CuSO4. Copper sulfate is an algicide. It kills the algae. So basically, it's not a problem for us. It's not a problem for the water company that supplies us with water. It's not a problem only because you can control blue-green algae, keep them from overpopulating by introducing copper sulfate. Without it, they could be a problem. We could be drinking toxic water. So, the question we have to address is, where do you generally find these blue-green algae? Well, I told you they can play a major role in fresh water. They can play a minor role in the ocean in general. If we take a look at the ocean in general, they're not significant to primary production in the ocean in general. By the way, this term primary production is something you should be familiar with. When we talk about primary production, we're talking about producing the first living organisms from inorganic material. Primary production means plants. Plants take inorganic material. They take carbon dioxide, they take water, they take minerals, and they make living organisms out of it. Right? So when we talk about primary production, it means first production. The first production of living material, of organic material. Right. So cyanophyta, as are all phytoplankton, are primary producers. Well, generally in the ocean, they're not terribly important. But in certain places in the ocean, in certain places, I should say, in marine ecosystems, they're very important. Where are those places? Well, one place that they're very important are on mudflats. What's a mudflat? When we took that trip to the Hackensack Meadowlands, the tide was out, and all you saw was mud in some areas. Remember that? Especially when we got to the end of that trail and looked to where the water was spilling out. Was it all mud at the time, or did it have water on it? Once we got over that berm? I thought it was muddy, but in any case, if it wasn't muddy then, it's muddy twice a day when the tide goes out. Okay? Mudflats, which are common in estuaries when the tide goes out, have loads of these cyanophyta on the surface. And of course they would be grazed on by snails and a whole bunch of other organisms as well. One day I got a call from, it wasn't a state agency, it was from some local agency, some town around here, and they found a whole bunch of dead geese. And they couldn't figure out what killed the geese. And they called in a veterinarian. The veterinarian guessed that it was probably botulism. My guess was that it was most likely blue-green algae, toxic blue-green algae. Why? Because I'm not aware of geese going into the mud in order to get their food. If they went into the mud, then there would be anaerobic conditions, oxygenless conditions, where you would find botulinobacteria. So he guessed, I guessed. And my guess is still that they probably consumed some toxic blue-green algae which were on the surface of the mud. So on the surface of the mud, these blue-green algae serve as food for snails and for some other invertebrates, including polychaetes. Remember, only a few of them are toxic. Not all of them are toxic. But most of them are unpleasant, at least to humans. In terms of their appearance, blue-green algae are unlike most other phytoplankton. Most blue-green algae exist in colonies. For example, here's one blue-green algae. Here's the algae right over here, and it produces a jelly coat. Several layers, in fact, of a jelly coat around its surface. And usually they exist in groups like this. Here's the blue-green algae. Here is the jelly coat around it. And you usually have, for this particular one, 4 of these. So just so you see the organism and you see how much slime there is around it. This particular organism, no need to write it down, is called Gleocapsa, although I'll show it to you in one of the labs that I have set up. So a tremendous amount of slime. There's also blue-green algae that are elongated like this, and that form is really consists of numerous individual cells all stacked together. This particular organism is called Oscillatoria. And I simply mention that because the name describes its activity. If you have one strand, I'll get in front of the camera, one strand of Oscillatoria here and another strand of Oscillatoria here, what will happen is they will begin to oscillate. They'll move like this. And so if you have a whole bunch of these under the water, they'll move back and forth like this, and some that are on the bottom will move up to the top, some on the top will move up to the bottom. This way, the oscillation allows each one of them to get into the light level that it prefers. So here we have some blue-green algae that are able to move by themselves. There's one blue-green algae. This is my favorite just because it's a big surprise. It looks exactly like a white grape. It looks exactly like a white grape. If I put it on the table, you say, oh, you mind if I have some of these? Don't eat it. The name of this is nostoc, and I'm not particularly interested in you remembering that. If you take a look inside it, this grape really consists of a whole bunch of individual cells surrounded by a slimy material, all existing in a chain. And that's what makes up this grape. On the outside, it looks like a grape. On the inside, it looks like a chain of individual cells surrounded by mucus. Okay, so these are not what you think of as phytoplankton. Most of the blue-green algae are, in fact, exist as colonies as opposed to existing as single cells. All right, so if they're important in freshwater, not in marine ecosystems, why do I bother to mention it? Well, they are important in some marine ecosystems. I mentioned marine systems such as mudflats, and also in certain tropical waters. And there is a particular one of these blue-green algae that is important in tropical waters, and that's called Trichodesmium. And the reason that is important is that it is a nitrogen fixer. It's responsible for nitrogen fixation. And tropical waters are very poor, generally, in nitrogen. Nitrogen is an essential element. Tropical waters, for reasons you'll understand more fully a little bit later on, are very poor in nitrogen. And if you don't have any nitrogen, you can't have anything grow. These organisms are nitrogen fixers, meaning they are able to take nitrogen from the air and from the water and attach it, fix it to other chemicals like oxygen, like hydrogen. When I say fix, it doesn't mean something's broken. It really comes from the word affix. Whoops.
What do you attach it to?
I put that out of camera range, I think. Oh, no, it was within camera range. What?
What did you say it attaches it to?
It attaches the nitrogen to a hydrogen or an oxygen, making ammonia, making nitrates and nitrites. And I mention this because when it affixes it to these chemicals, to oxygen or hydrogen, now plants can make use of it. Plants cannot make use of nitrogen all by itself. Most plants can't use nitrogen all by itself. But plants can make use of NH3, NO2, NO3. So it is essential to convert nitrogen in the air or in the water to one of these compounds. And that's what trichodesmium does. So where nitrogen is poor, as it generally is in tropical waters, trichodesmium can be key to make that ecosystem productive, to allow primary production in that ecosystem. All right, just so that nobody's confused, when I say nitrogen fixer, it doesn't mean something's broken. The fix comes from the word affix, which means to attach, So nitrogen fixation is attaching nitrogen, things like hydrogen and oxygen, so they can be used by plants. All right, so cyanophyta, generally not a big deal in the ocean. Important in some fresh waters for the reasons I mentioned. Not a big deal in the ocean generally, but in mudflats and in tropical waters, they can be very important. So much for cyanophyta. By the way, should you look up cyanophyta, cyanophytas are victims of new classifications. Cyanophyta was at one time considered a bacteria. So maybe we should call it cyanobacteria. More recently, it's within its own group, the Archaea. Anyway, our purpose is not here to discuss taxonomy or categories of things. But should you look it up and it says, wait a minute, it's not a phytoplankton? Well, for our purposes, we're calling it phytoplankton. It's a photosynthetic organism, so this is the best place to put it in any discussion of organisms. All right, so much for cyanophyta. Next group of organisms are the green algae. So these are the blue-green algae. Oh, and by the way, I should mention this. They're called blue-green algae because they contain a pigment that's blue-green. They contain a pigment that's blue-green. When you look at some of these, they're not blue-green in color because their color may be masked by other pigments. Some of these are red in color. Some of these are brown in color. But because they contain this blue-green pigment, they are classified within this category. And just by the way, to give you an example of a red one, how many people recall reading in the Bible the story of Moses turning the Nile to blood? Anybody recall that? Okay. Well, guess what? It happens today. The Nile today turns to blood. What does it mean, turn to blood? It means the Nile turns red. And what's responsible for it is a blue-green algae that's red in color. So under certain conditions, the Nile and other bodies of water will turn red with blue-green algae. And you recall in that same Bible story, the frogs died and the fish died, right? It was a whole mess. Why? Because that was a toxic blue-green algae. And the same thing will happen today. Okay, you had a question?
So you're saying that the blue-green algae isn't always literally blue and green?
I'm saying that it always contains a blue-green pigment, but it doesn't appear to be blue-green all the time because there could be other colors, okay? All right, so now we have this group, Chlorophyta. Chlorophyta What this means is green algae. And here generally we're talking about a grass green color. A grass green color. Chlorophyta are characterized generally by having a cup-shaped chloroplast. So here's a cell, and here is this chloroplast. The chloroplast, of course, is that structure which contains chlorophyll, and that's a cup-shaped chloroplast. What's interesting about the chlorophyta, the green algae, is that they are in a whole variety of forms. There are some that are single-celled, some that consist of single cells, such as this one, which I'll label chlorella. And there are some that are multi-celled. In fact, they come in big sheets. When we went on a field trip on Saturday, I found one small one. Usually we see sheets of these. And we're talking about a sheet of, looks like green saran wrap, about this big. About this big means it's about 8 inches, sometimes not quite a foot in diameter. It looks like a sheet of saran wrap, about 8 inches in diameter, that's perfectly green. Did we see any on that trip to that Long Island Sound? Did I find any of those? No? Okay. This particular one is called sea lettuce. Its genus name is Ulva. Sea lettuce or Ulva. Well, it's not a phytoplankton, but it is a green algae. And there are some that are phytoplankton with flagella, and they can swim around. In fact, there's one of these which is very important in the Dead Sea. In fact, it's a source of an industry in the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is between Israel and Jordan, and in the Dead Sea, this organism, which is called Dunaliella salina, is abundant in the Dead Sea. Dunaliella salina. Anybody know why the Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea? Yeah.
Because it's salt water?
It's salt water, very dense salt water. Concentration about 46 parts per thousand. Whereas the ocean is only about 33 parts per thousand. And in fact, it's so dense that very few organisms can survive there. So it's pretty dead, is the point, compared with any other body of salt water. And so the name Dunaliella salina, salina stands for salt. So this is a phytoplankton, which is flagellated, so it kind of looks like what I just showed you over here. And it produces a chemical that's very useful in industry. And there are cooperative agreements between Israel and Jordan to harvest this particular organism. All right, so here we have chlorella and we have Dunaliella salina. These are green algae that do play important roles in marine ecosystems, if we wanted to call the Dead Sea a marine ecosystem. But Dunaliella salina also exists in the ocean as well. All right, so they contribute to the work of the phytoplankton, meaning they contribute to this entire food chain that exists in the ocean. Well, all right, so what's the major point here? The chlorophyta have a variety of forms. Some are phytoplankton, some are colonies making up ulva, a big form. Some have special characteristics. That is, they're able to tolerate extreme conditions of salt. And in fact, one of the characteristics of chlorophyta in general is that they're highly tolerant of extreme conditions. What does that mean? They can tolerate a good deal of heat that other organisms wouldn't be able to tolerate. So when we went to Long Island Sound, and I said, picture some of these tide pools over here, where you have seawater coming in there. What's going to happen in that tide pool? Well, what's going to happen is, let me just erase some of this. What's going to happen is, some of this water is going to evaporate. You'll leave the salt behind, and this water will evaporate. So you're going to have a very highly saline, highly salty tide pool. What's going to survive there? Some of the chlorophyta, because they're highly tolerant of extreme salinity. They're also highly tolerant of extreme temperatures. So salinity, they can tolerate extreme temperatures, especially extreme heat. They also can tolerate, and that's what you would have in the summer in one of these tide pools. Sun baking down on the rock filled with water, that's going to really cook. You'd have the chlorophyta among the very few algae that survive. One of the tricks they have for survival is that they can discourage, and I'll use that word in quotes, certain predators. They can discourage certain predators. For example, this organism, chlorella, will produce a toxin called chlorellin, a toxin called chlorellin, which will kill lots of invertebrates that otherwise would eat it. It will kill, for example, copepods. I made a discovery a number of years ago, which was fairly important, except for the fact that somebody made the discovery just a few months before I did. I was up in Maine, and I noticed that there were very few mosquitoes in an area that was packed with little ponds where mosquitoes would ordinarily breed. So I looked into the ponds, and I saw that the ponds were green, loaded with some of these chlorophyta, most likely chlorella. So I started thinking about that. No mosquitoes and lots of chlorella. I wonder if the chlorella